Chapter 17 of As a Thief in the Night by Arthur B. Reeve. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Thorndyke retraces the trail. Apparently, Thorndyke had seen me from the window as I crossed the walk, for when I reached the landing, I found him standing in the open doorway of his chambers, and at the sight of him, whatever traces of unreasonable resentment may have lingered in my mind melted away instantly. He grasped my hand with almost affectionate warmth, and looking at me earnestly and with the most kindly solicitude, said, "I am glad you have come, Mayfield. I couldn't bear to think of you alone in your chambers, haunted by this horrible tragedy." "You have heard, then, about Barbara, I mean?" "Yes, Miller called and told me. Of course he is righteously angry that she has escaped, and I sympathize with him. But for us, for you and me, it is a great deliverance. I was profoundly relieved when I heard that she was gone, that the axe had fallen once for all." "Yes," I admitted, "it was better than the frightful alternative of a trial and what would have followed. But still it was terrible to see her lying dead, and to know that it was my hand, the hand of her oldest and dearest friend, that had struck the blow." "It was my hand, Mayfield, not yours, that actually struck the blow. But even if it had been yours instead of your agent's, what could have been more just and proper than that retribution should have come through the hand of the friend and guardian of that poor murdered girl?" I assented with a shudder to the truth of what he had said, but still my mind was too confused to allow me to see things in their true perspective. Barbara, my friend, was still more real to me than Barbara the murderess. He nodded sympathetically enough when I explained this, but rejoined firmly, "You must try, my dear fellow, to see things as they really are. Shocking as this tragedy is, it would have been immeasurably worse if that terrible woman had not received timely warning. As it is, the horrible affair has run its course swiftly and is at an end. And do not forget that if the axe has fallen on the guilty, its menace has been lifted from the innocent. Madeline Norris and Anthony Wallingford will sleep in peace tonight, free from the spectre of suspicion that has haunted them ever since Harold Monkhouse died. As to the woman whose body you found this morning, she was a monster. She could not have been permitted to live. Her very existence was a menace to the lives of all who came into contact with her." Again, I could not but assent to his stern indictment and his impartial statement of the facts. "Very well, Mayfield," said he. "Then try to put it to yourself that for you the worst has happened and is done with. Try to put it away as a thing that now belongs to the past and is, in so far as it is possible, to be forgotten." "As far as is possible," I repeated. "Yes, of course you are quite right, Thorndyke. But forgetfulness is not a thing which we can command at will." "Very true," he replied. "But yet we can control to a large extent the direction of our thoughts. We can find interests and occupations. And speaking of occupations, let me show you some of Polton's productions." He rose, and putting a small table by the side of my chair, placed on it one or two small copper plaques and a silver medallion which he had taken from a drawer. The medallion was the self-portrait of Stella, which had lain dormant in the wax mold through all the years which had passed since her death, and as I took it in my hand and gazed at the beloved face, I found it beautiful beyond my expectations. "It is a most charming little work," I said, holding it so that the lamplight fell most favorably on the relic. "I am infinitely obliged to you, Thorndyke." "Don't thank me," said he. "The whole credit is due to Polton. Not that he wants any thanks, for the work has yielded him hours of perfect happiness. But here he is with the products of another kind of work." As he spoke, Polton entered with a tray and began in his neat, noiseless way to lay the table. I don't know how much he knew, but when I caught his eye and his smile of greeting, it seemed to me that friendliness and kindly sympathy exuded from every line of his quaint, crinkly face. I thanked him for his skillful treatment of my treasures, and then, observing that he was apparently laying the table for supper, would have excused myself. But Thorndyke would hear of no excuses. "My dear fellow," said he, "you are the very picture of physical exhaustion. I suspect that you have had practically no food today. A meal will help you to begin to get back to normal. And in any case, you mustn't disappoint Polton, who has been expecting you to supper and has probably made a special effort to do credit to the establishment." I could only repeat my acknowledgments of Polton's goodness, noting that he certainly must have made a special effort, to judge by the results which began to make themselves evident, and conquering my repugnance to the idea of eating, take my place at the table. It is perhaps somewhat humiliating to reflect that our emotional states, which we are apt to consider on a lofty spiritual plane, are controlled by matters so grossly material as the mere contents of our stomachs. But such is the degrading truth, as I now realized. For no sooner had I commenced a reluctant attack on the products of Polton's efforts and drunk a glass of Burgundy, delicately warmed by that versatile artist to the exact optimum temperature, then my mental and physical unrest began to subside and allow a reasonable, normal outlook to develop, with a corresponding bodily state. In effect, I made quite a good meal, and found myself listening with lively interest to Thorndyke's account of the technical processes involved in converting my little plaster plaques and the wax mold into their final states in copper and silver. Nevertheless, in the intervals of conversation, the unforgettable events of the morning and the preceding night tended to creep back into my consciousness, and now a question which I had hitherto hardly considered began to clamor for an answer. Towards the end of the meal, I put it into words. Apropos of nothing in our previous conversation, I asked, "How did you know Thorndyke?" And as he looked up inquiringly, I added, "I mean, how were you able to make so confident a guess, for, of course, you couldn't actually know?" "When do you mean?" he asked. "I mean that when you applied for a Home Office authority, you must have had something to go on beyond a mere guess." "Certainly I had," he replied. "It was not a guess at all. It was a certainty. When I made the application, I was able to say that I had positive knowledge that Stella Keene had been poisoned with arsenic. The examination of the poor child's body was not for my information. I would have avoided it if that had been possible, but it was not. As soon as my declaration was made, the exhumation became inevitable. The Crown could not have prosecuted on a charge of poisoning without an examination of the victim's body." "But, Thorndyke," I expostulated, "how could you have been certain, I mean certain in a legal sense? Surely it could have been no more than a matter of inference." "It was not," he replied. "It was a matter of demonstrated fact. I could have taken the case into court and proved the fact of arsenical poisoning, but of course the jury would have demanded evidence from an examination of the body, and quite properly too. Every possible corroboration should be obtained in a criminal trial." "Certainly," I agreed, "but still I find your statement incomprehensible. You speak of demonstrated fact. But what means of demonstration had you? There was my diary. I take it that that was the principal source of your information. In fact, I can't think of any other. But the diary could only have yielded documentary evidence, which is quite a different thing from demonstrated fact." "Quite," he agreed. "The diary contributed handsomely to the train of circumstantial evidence that I had constructed. But the demonstration, the final positive proof, came from another source, a very curious and unexpected source." "I suppose," said I, "as the case is finished and dealt with, there would be no harm in my asking you how you arrived at your conclusion?" "Not at all," he replied. "The whole investigation is a rather long story, but I will give you a summary of it if you like." "Why a summary?" I objected. "I would rather have it in extenso if it will not weary you to relate it." "It will be more likely to weary you," he replied. "But if you are equal to a lengthy exposition, let us take to our easy chairs and combine bodily comfort with forensic discourse." We drew up the 2 armchairs before the hearth, and when Polton had made up the fire and placed between us a small table furnished with a decanter and glasses, Thorndyke began his exposition. "This case is in some respects one of the most curious and interesting that I have met with in the whole of my experience of medical legal practice. At the first glance, as I told you at the time, the problem that it presented seemed hopelessly beyond solution. All the evidence appeared to be in the past and utterly irrecoverable. The vital questions were concerned with events that had passed unrecorded, and of which there seemed to be no possibility that they could ever be disinterred from the oblivion in which they were buried. Looking back now on the body of evidence that has gradually accumulated, I am astonished at the way in which the apparently forgotten past has given up its secrets, one after another, until it has carried its revelation from surmise to probability and from probability at last to incontestable proof. The inquiry divides itself into certain definite stages, each of which added new matter to that which had gone before. We begin naturally with the inquest on Harold Monkhouse, and we may consider this in three aspects: the ascertained condition of the body, the evidence of the witnesses, and the state of affairs disclosed by the proceedings viewed as a whole. First, as to the body, there appeared to be no doubt that Monkhouse died from arsenical poisoning, but there was no clear evidence as to how the poison had been administered. It was assumed that it had been taken in food or in medicine, that it had been swallowed, and no alternative method of administration was suggested or considered. But on studying the medical witnesses' evidence, and comparing it with the descriptions of the patient's symptoms, I was disposed to doubt whether the poison had actually been taken by the mouth at all. "Why," I exclaimed, "how else could it have been taken?" There are quite a number of different ways in which poisonous doses of arsenic can be taken. Finely powdered arsenic is readily absorbed by the skin. There have been several deaths from the use of violet powder contaminated with arsenic, and clothing containing powdered arsenic would produce poisonous effects. Then there are certain arsenical gases, notably arsine or arseniuretted hydrogen, which are intensely poisonous and which possibly account for a part of the symptoms in poisoning from arsenical wallpapers. There seemed to me to be some suggestion of arsenical gas in Monkhouse's case, but it was obviously not pure gas poisoning. The impression conveyed to me was that of a mixed poisoning, that the arsenic had been partly inhaled and partly applied to the skin, but very little, if any, taken by the mouth. You are not forgetting that arsenic was actually found in the stomach? No, but the quantity was very minute, and a minute quantity is of no significance. One of the many odd and misleading facts about arsenic poisoning is that, in whatever way the drug is taken, a small quantity is always found in the stomach, and there are always some signs of gastric irritation. The explanation seems to be that arsenic which has got into the blood in any way, through the skin, the lungs, or otherwise, tends to be eliminated in part through the stomach. At any rate, the fact is that the presence of minute quantities of arsenic in the stomach affords no evidence that the poison was swallowed. But, I objected, what of the Fowler solution which was found in the medicine? Exactly, said he. That was the discrepancy that attracted my attention. The assumption was that deceased had taken in his medicine a quantity of Fowler's solution representing about 1.5 grains of arsenious acid. If that had been so, we should have expected to find a very appreciable quantity in the stomach, much more than was actually found. The condition of the body did not agree with the dose that was assumed to have been taken, and when one came to examine the evidence of the various witnesses, there was further room for doubt. 2 of them had noticed the medicine at the time when the Fowler solution had not been added, but no witness had noticed it after the alleged change and before the death of deceased. The presence of the Fowler solution was not observed until several days after his death. Taking all the facts together, there was a distinct suggestion that the solution had been added to the medicine at some time after Monkhouse's death. But this suggestion tended to confirm my suspicion that the poison had not been swallowed. For the discovery of the Fowler solution in the medicine would tend to divert inquiry, and did in fact divert it, from any other method of administering the poison. To finish with the depositions, not only was there a complete lack of evidence even suggesting any one person as the probable delinquent, there was not the faintest suggestion of any motive that one could consider seriously. The paltry pecuniary motive applied to all the parties and could not be entertained in respect of any of them. The only person who could have had a motive was Barbara. She was a young, attractive woman, married to an elderly, unattractive husband. If she had been attached to another man, she would have had the strongest and commonest of all motives. But there was nothing in the depositions to hint at any other man, and since she was absent from home when the poisoning occurred, she appeared to be outside the area of possible suspicion. And now to look at the evidence as a whole. You remember Miller's comment. There was something queer about the case, something very oddly elusive. At the first glance it seemed to bristle with suspicious facts. But when those facts were scrutinized, they meant nothing. There were plenty of clues, but they led nowhere. There was Madeline Norris, who prepared the victim's food, an obvious suspect. But then it appeared that the poison was in the medicine, not in the food. There was Wallingford, who actually had poison in his possession. But it was the wrong poison. There was the bottle that had undoubtedly contained arsenic, but it was nobody's bottle. There was the bottle that smelled of lavender and had red stains in it and was found in Miss Norris's possession, but it contained no arsenic, and so on. Now all this was very strange. The strongest suspicion was thrown on a number of people collectively, but it failed every time to connect itself with any one individually. I don't know precisely what Miller thought of it, but to me it conveyed the strong impression of a scheme, of something arranged, and arranged with extraordinary skill and ingenuity. I had the feeling that behind all these confusing and inconsistent appearances was a something quite different, with which they had no real connection, that all these apparent clues were a sort of smokescreen thrown up to conceal the actual mechanism of the murder. What could the mechanism of the murder have been? That was what I asked myself. And by whom could the arrangements have been made and carried out? Here the question of motive became paramount. What motive could be imagined? And who could have been affected by it? That seemed to be the essential part of the problem, and the only one that offered the possibility of investigation. Now, as I have said, the most obvious motive in cases of this kind is that of getting rid of a husband or wife to make room for another. And ignoring moral considerations, it is a perfectly rational motive, for the murder of the unwanted spouse is the only possible means of obtaining the desired release. The question was, could such a motive have existed in the present case? And the answer was that, on inspection, it appeared to be a possible motive, although there was no evidence that it actually existed. But assuming its possibility for the sake of argument, who could have been affected by it? At once one saw that Madeline Norris was excluded. The death of Harold Monkhouse did not affect her in this respect at all. There remained only Barbara and Wallingford. To take the latter first, he was a young man, and the wife was a young, attractive woman. He had lived in the same house with her, appeared to be her social equal, and was apparently on terms of pleasant intimacy with her. If he had any warm feelings towards her, her husband's existence formed an insuperable obstacle to the realization of his wishes. There was no evidence that he had any such feelings, but the possibility had to be borne in mind. And there were further facts that he evidently had some means of obtaining poisons, and that he had ample opportunities for administering them to the deceased. All things considered, Wallingford appeared, prima facie, to be the most likely person to have committed the murder. Now, to take the case of Barbara. In the first place, there was the possibility that she might have had some feeling towards Wallingford, in which case she would probably have been acting in collusion with him, and her absence from home on each occasion when the poisoning took place would have been part of the arrangement. But excluding Wallingford, and supposing her to be concerned with some other man, did her absence from home absolutely exclude the possibility of her being the poisoner? There were suggestions of skillful and ingenious arrangements to create false appearances. Was it possible that those arrangements included some method by which the poison could be administered during her absence without the connivance or knowledge of any other person? I pondered this question carefully by the light of all the details disclosed at the inquest, and the conclusion that I reached was that, given a certain amount of knowledge, skill, and executive ability, the thing was possible. But as soon as I had admitted the possibility, I was impressed by the way in which the suggestion fitted in with the known facts and served to explain them. For all the arranged appearances pointed to the use of Fowler's solution, administered by mouth. But this could not possibly have been the method if the poisoner were 100 miles away. And as I have said, I was strongly inclined to infer, from the patient's symptoms and the conditions of the body, that the poison had not been administered by the mouth. But all this, as you will realize, was purely hypothetical. None of the assumptions was supported by a particle of positive evidence. They merely represented possibilities which I proposed to bear in mind in the interpretation of any new evidence that might come into view. This brings us to the end of the first stage, the conclusions arrived at by a careful study of the depositions. But following hard on the inquest was your visit to me when you gave me the particulars of your past life and your relations with Barbara and Monkhouse. Now, your little autobiographical sketch was extremely enlightening, and as it turned out, of vital importance. In the first place, it made clear to me that your relations with Barbara were much more intimate than I had supposed. You were not merely friends of long standing, you were virtually in the relation of brother and sister. But with this very important difference, that you were not brother and sister. An adopted brother is a possible husband, an adopted sister is a possible wife. And when I considered your departure to Canada with the intention of remaining there for life, and your unexpected return, I found that the bare possibility that Barbara might wish to be released from her marriage had acquired a certain measure of probability. But further, your narrative brought into view another person who had died, and the death of that person presented a certain analogy with the death of Monkhouse. For if Barbara had wished to be your wife, both these persons stood immovably in the way of her wishes. Of course, there was no evidence that she had any such wish, and the death of Stella was alleged to have been due to natural causes. Nevertheless, the faint hypothetical suggestion offered by these new facts were strikingly similar to those offered by the previous facts. The next stage opened when I read your diary, especially the volume written during the last year of Stella's life. But now, one came out of the region of mere speculative hypothesis into that of very definite suspicion. I had not read very far when, from your chance references to the symptoms of Stella's illness, I came to the decided conclusion that possibly mingled with the symptoms of real disease were those of more or less chronic arsenical poisoning. And what was even more impressive, those symptoms seemed to be closely comparable with Monkhouse's symptoms, particularly in the suggestion of a mixed poisoning partly due to minute doses of arsine. I need not go into details, but you will remember that you make occasional reference to slight attacks of jaundice, which is very characteristic of arsine poisoning, and to eye strain, which the spectacles fail to relieve. But redness, smarting and watering of the eyes is an almost constant symptom of chronic arsenic poisoning, and there were various other symptoms of a decidedly suspicious character to which you refer and which I need not go into now. Then a careful study of the diary brought into view another very impressive fact. There were considerable fluctuations in Stella's condition. Sometimes she appeared to be so far improving as to lead you to some hopes of her actual recovery. Then there would be a rather sudden change for the worse, and she would lose more than she had gained. Now, at this time, Barbara had already become connected with the political movement which periodically called her away from home for periods varying from 1 to 4 weeks, and when I drew up a table of the dates of her departures and returns, I found that the periods included between them, that is, the periods during which she was absent from home, coincided most singularly with Stella's relapses. The coincidence was so complete that when I had set the data out in a pair of diagrams in the form of graphs, the resemblance of the two diagrams was most striking. I will show you the diagrams presently. But there was something else that I was on the lookout for in the diary, but it was only quite near the end that I found it. Quite early, I learned that Stella was accustomed to read and work at night by the light of a candle. But I could not discover what sort of candle she used, whether it was an ordinary household candle or one of some special kind. At last I came on the entry in which you described the making of the wax mold, and then I had the information that I had been looking for. In that entry you mentioned that you began by lifting the reflector off the candle, by which I learned that the receptacle used was not an ordinary candlestick. Then you remarked that the candle was of a good hard wax, by which I learned that it was not an ordinary household candle, these being usually composed of a rather soft paraffin wax. Apparently, it was a stearine candle such as is made for use in candle lamps. But, I expostulated, how could it possibly matter what sort of candle she used? The point seems to be quite irrelevant. The point, he replied, was not only relevant, it was of crucial importance. But I had better explain. When I was considering the circumstances surrounding the poisoning of Monkhouse, I decided that the probabilities pointed to Barbara as the poisoner. But she was 100 miles away when the poisoning occurred, hence the question that I asked myself was this: Was there any method that was possible and practicable in the existing circumstances by which Barbara could have arranged that the poisoning could be effected during her absence? And the answer was that there was such a method, but only one. The food and the medicine were prepared and administered by those who were on the spot. But the candles were supplied by Barbara and by her put into the bedside candle box before she went away, and they would operate during her absence. "But," I exclaimed, "do I understand you to suggest that it is possible to administer poison by means of a candle?" "Certainly," he replied. "It is quite possible and quite practicable. If a candle is charged with finely powdered arsenious acid, white arsenic, when the candle is burnt, the arsenious acid will be partly vaporized and partly converted into arsine, or arsenurated hydrogen. Most of the arsine will be burnt in the flame and reconverted into arsenious acid, which will float in the air, as it condenses, in the form of an almost invisible white cloud. The actual result will be that the air in the neighborhood of the candle will contain small traces of arsine, which is an intensely poisonous gas, and considerable quantities of arsenious acid, floating about in the form of infinitely minute crystals. This impalpable dust will be breathed into the lungs of any person near the candle and will settle on the skin, from which it will be readily absorbed into the blood and produce all the poisonous effects of arsenic. Now, in the case of Harold Monkhouse, not only was there a special kind of candle supplied by the suspected person, but, as I have told you, the symptoms during life and the appearances of the dead body all seemed to me to point to some method of poisoning through the lungs and skin rather than by way of the stomach, and also suggested a mixed poisoning in which arsine played some part. So that the candle was not only a possible medium of the poisoning, it was by far the most probable. Hence, when I came to consider Stella's illness and noted the strong suggestion of arsenic poisoning, and when I noted the parallelism of her illness with that of Monkhouse, I naturally kept a watchful eye for a possible parallelism in the method of administering the poison. And not only did I find that parallelism, but in that very entry I found strong confirmation of my suspicion that the candle was poison. You will remember that you mentioned the circumstance that on the night following the making of the wax mold you were quite seriously unwell. Apparently you were suffering from a slight attack of acute arsenical poisoning, due to your having inhaled some of the fumes from the burning candle. "Yes, I remember that," said I. "But what is puzzling me is how the candles could have been obtained. Surely it is not possible to buy arsenical candles." "No," he replied, "it is not. But it is possible to buy a candle mold, with which it is quite easy to make them. Remember that not so very long ago, most country people used to make their own candles, and the hinged molds that they used are still by no means rare. You will find specimens in most local museums and in curio shops in country towns, and you can often pick them up in farmhouse sales. And if you have a candle mold, the making of arsenical candles is quite a simple affair. Barbara, as we know, used to buy a particular German brand of stearine candles. All that she had to do was to melt the candles, put the separated wicks into a mold, stir some finely powdered white arsenic into the melted wax, and pour it into the mold. When the wax was cool, the mold would be opened and the candles taken out. These hinged molds usually made about 6 candles at a time. Then it would be necessary to scrape off the seam left by the mold and smooth the candles to make them look like those sold in the shops. "It was a most diabolically ingenious scheme," said I. "It was," he agreed. "The whole villainous plan was very completely conceived and most efficiently carried out. But to return to our argument. The discovery that Stella had used a special form of candle left me in very little doubt that Barbara was the poisoner and that poisoned candles had been the medium used in both crimes. For we were now out of the region of mere hypothesis. We were dealing with genuine circumstantial evidence. But that evidence was still much too largely inferential to serve as the material for a prosecution. We still needed some facts of a definite and tangible kind, and as soon as you came back from your travels on the southeastern circuit, fresh facts began to accumulate. Passing over the proceedings of Wallingford and his follower and the infernal machine, all of which were encouraging as offering corroboration, but of no immediate assistance, The first really important accretion of evidence occurred in the connection with our visit to the empty house in Hillborough Square. "Ha!" I exclaimed. "Then you did find something significant, in spite of your pessimistic tone at the time?" I may say, Thorndyke, that I had a feeling that you went to that house with a definite expectation of finding some specific thing. Was I wrong? No, you were right. I went there with the expectation of finding one thing and a faint hope of finding another, and both the expectation and the hope were justified by the event. My main purpose in that expedition was to obtain samples of the wallpaper from Monkhouse's room, but I thought it just possible that the soot from the bedroom chimneys might yield some information, and it did. To begin with the wallpaper, the condition of the room made it easy to secure specimens. I tore off about a dozen pieces and wrote a number on each, to correspond with numbers that I marked on a rough sketch plan of the room which I drew first. My expectation was that if, as I believed, arsenical candles had been burnt in that room, arsenic would have been deposited on all the walls, but in varying amounts, proportionate to the distance of the wall from the candle. The loose piece of paper on the wall by the bed was, of course, the real touchstone of the case, for if there was no arsenic in it, the theory of the arsenical candle would hardly be tenable. I therefore took the extra precaution of writing a full description of its position on the back of the piece and deposited it for greater safety in my letter case. As soon as I reached home that day, I spread out the torn fragment on the wide stage of a culture microscope and examined its outer surface with a strong top-light. And the very first glance settled the question. The whole surface was spangled over with minute crystals, many of them hardly a 10,000th of an inch in diameter, sparkling in the strong light like diamonds and perfectly unmistakable, the characteristic octahedral crystals of arsenious acid. But distinctive as they were, I took nothing for granted. Snipping off a good-sized piece of the paper, I submitted it to the Marsh-Berzelius test and got a very pronounced arsenical mirror, which put the matter beyond any possible doubt or question. I may add that I tested all the other pieces and got an arsenic reaction from them all, varying roughly according to their distance from the table on which the candles stood. Thus the existence of the arsenical candle was no longer a matter of hypothesis or even of mere probability. It was virtually a demonstrated fact. The next question was, who put the arsenic into the candle? All the evidence, such as it was, pointed to Barbara. But there was not enough of it. No single fact connected her quite definitely with the candles, and it had to be admitted that they had passed through other hands than hers, and that the candle box was accessible to several people, especially during her absence. Clear evidence, then, was required to associate her or someone else with those poisoned candles, and I had just a faint hope that such evidence might be forthcoming. This was how I reasoned. Here was a case of poisoning in which the poison was self-administered and the actual poisoner was absent. Consequently, it was impossible to give a calculated dose on a given occasion, nor was it possible to estimate in advance the amount that would be necessary to produce the desired result. Since the poison was to be left within reach of the victim, to be taken from time to time, it would be necessary to leave a quantity considerably in excess of the amount actually required to produce death on any one occasion. It is probable that all the candles in the box were poisoned. In any case, most of them must have been, and as the box was filled to last for the whole intended time of Barbara's absence, there would be a remainder of poisoned candles in the box when Monkhouse died. But the incident of the faked medicine showed that the poisoner was fully alive to the possibility of an examination of the room. It was not likely that so cautious a criminal would leave such damning evidence as the arsenical candles in full view. For if by chance one of them had been lighted and the bearer had developed symptoms of poisoning, the murder would almost certainly have been out. In any case, we could assume that the poisoner would remove them and destroy them after putting ordinary candles in their place. But a candle is not a very easy thing to destroy. You can't throw it down a sink or smash it up and cast it into the rubbish bin. It must be burnt, and owing to its inflammability, it must be burnt carefully and rather slowly, and if it contains a big charge of arsenic, the operator must take considerable precautions. And finally, these particular candles had to be burnt secretly. Having regard to these considerations, I decided that the only safe and practicable way to get rid of them was to burn them in a fireplace with the window wide open. This would have to be done at night when all the household was asleep, so as to be safe from interruption and discovery, and a screen would have to be put before the fireplace to prevent the glare from being visible through the open window. If there were a fire in the grate, so much the better. The candles could be cut up into small pieces and thrown into the fire one at a time. Of course, the whole matter was speculative. There might have been no surplus candles, or if there were, they might have been taken out of the house and disposed of in some other way. But one could only act on the obvious probabilities and examine the chimneys, remembering that whereas a negative result would prove nothing for or against any particular person, a positive result would furnish very weighty evidence. Accordingly, I collected samples of soot from the various bedroom chimneys and from that of Barbara's boudoir, labeling each of them with the aid of the cards which you had left in the respective rooms. The results were, I think, quite conclusive. When I submitted the samples to analysis, I found them all practically free from arsenic, disregarding the minute traces that one expects to find in ordinary soot, with one exception. The soot from Barbara's bedroom chimney yielded not mere traces, but an easily measurable quantity, much too large to have been attributable to the coal burnt in the grate. Thus, you see, so far as the murder of Monkhouse was concerned, there was a fairly conclusive case against Barbara. It left not a shadow of doubt in my mind that she was the guilty person. But you will also see that it was not a satisfactory case to take into court. The whole of the evidence was scientific and might have appeared rather unconvincing to the ordinary juryman, though it would have been convincing enough to the judge. I debated with myself whether I should communicate my discoveries to the police and leave them to decide for or against the prosecution, or whether I should keep silence and seek for further evidence. And finally, I decided for the present to keep my own counsel. You will understand why. Yes, said I. You suspected that Stella, too, had been poisoned. Exactly. I had very little doubt of it. And you will notice that in this case there was available evidence of a kind that would be quite convincing to a jury, evidence obtainable from an examination of the victim's body. But here again I was disposed to adopt the waiting policy for 3 reasons. First, I should have liked to avoid the exhumation if possible. Second, if the exhumation were unavoidable, I was unwilling to apply for it until I was certain that arsenic would be found in the body. And third, although the proof that Stella had been poisoned would have strengthened the case enormously against Barbara, it would yet have added nothing to the evidence that a poisoned candle had been used. But proof of the poisoned candle was the kernel of the case against Barbara. If I could prove that Stella had been poisoned by means of a candle, that would render the evidence absolutely irresistible. This I was not at present able to do, but I had some slight hopes that the deficiency might be made up, that some new facts might come into view if I waited. And, as there was nothing that called for immediate action, I decided to wait, and in due course the deficiency was made up and the new facts did come into view. As he paused, I picked up Stella's medallion and looked at it with a new and somber interest. Holding it up before him, I said, "I am assuming, Thorndyke, that the new facts were in some way connected with this. Am I right?" "Yes," he replied, "you are entirely right. The connection between that charming little work and the evidence that sent that monster of wickedness to her death is one of the strangest and most impressive circumstances that has become known to me in the whole of my experience. It is no exaggeration to say that when you and Stella were working on that medallion, you were forging the last link in the chain of evidence that could have dragged the murderess to the gallows." He paused, and having replenished my glass, took the medallion in his hand and looked at it thoughtfully. Then he knocked out and refilled his pipe, and I waited expectantly for the completion of this singular story. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of As a Thief in the Night, by Arthur B. Reeve. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Final Proof. We now, Thorndyke resumed, enter the final stage of the inquiry. Hitherto we have dealt with purely scientific evidence which would have had to be communicated to the jury and which they would have had to take on trust, with no convincing help from their own eyes. We had evidence, conclusive to ourselves, that Monkhouse had been murdered by means of a poisoned candle, but we could not produce the candle or any part of it. We had nothing visible or tangible to show to the jury to give them the feeling of confidence and firm conviction which they rightly demand when they have to decide an issue involving the life or death of the accused. It was this something that could be seen and handled that I sought, and sought in vain until that momentous evening when I called at your chambers to return your diary. I remember that as I entered the room and cast my eyes over the things that were spread out on the table, I received quite a shock. For the first glance showed me that amongst those things were two objects that exactly fulfilled the conditions of the final test. There was the wax mold, a part and the greater part of one of the suspected candles, and there was the truss of hair, a portion of the body of the person suspected to have been poisoned. With these two objects it was possible to determine with absolute certainty whether that person had or had not been poisoned with arsenic, and if she had, whether the candle had or had not been the medium by which the poison was administered. But, I said, you knew from the diary of the existence of the wax mold. I knew that it had existed, but I naturally supposed that the cast had been taken and the mold destroyed years ago, though I had intended to ask you about it. However, here it was miraculously preserved, against all probabilities, still awaiting completion. Of course I recognized it instantly, and began to cast about in my mind for some means of making the necessary examination without disclosing my suspicions. For you will realize that I was unwilling to say anything to you about Stella's death until the question was settled one way or the other. If the examination had shown no arsenic either in the candle or in the hair, it would not have been necessary to say anything to you at all. But while I was debating the matter, the problem solved itself. As soon as I came to look at Stella's unfinished works, I saw that they cried aloud to be completed, and that Polton was the proper person to carry out the work. I made the suggestion, which I should have made in any case, and when you adopted it, I decided to say nothing but to apply the tests when the opportunity offered. I am glad, said I, to hear you say that you would have made the suggestion in any case. It looked at first like a rather cold-blooded pretext to get possession of the things. But you were speaking of the hair. Can you depend on finding recognizable traces of arsenic in the hair of a person who has been poisoned? Certainly you can, he replied. The position is this. When arsenic is taken, it becomes diffused throughout the whole body, including the blood, the bones, and the skin. But as soon as a dose of arsenic is taken, the poison begins to be eliminated from the body, and if no further dose is taken, the whole of the poison is thrown off in a comparatively short time until none remains in the tissues, with one exception. That exception is the epidermis, or outer skin, with its appendages, the finger and toenails and the hair. These structures differ from all others in that, instead of growing interstitially and being alive throughout, they grow at a certain growing point and then become practically dead structures. Thus the hair grows at the growing point where the bulb joins the true skin. Each day a new piece of hair is produced at the living root, but when once it has come into being it grows no more, but is simply pushed up from below by the next portion. Thenceforward it undergoes no change, excepting that it gradually moves upwards as new portions are added at the root. It is virtually a dead, unchanging structure. Now suppose a person to take a considerable dose of arsenic. That arsenic becomes diffused throughout all the living tissues and is for a time deposited in them. The growing point of the hair is a living tissue, and of course the arsenic becomes deposited in it. Then the process of elimination begins, and the arsenic is gradually removed from the living tissues. But in 24 hours, what was the growing point of the hair has been pushed up about the 50th of an inch and is no longer a growing structure. It is losing its vitality, and as it ceases to be a living tissue, it ceases to be affected by the process of elimination. Hence the arsenic which was deposited in it when it was a living tissue is never removed. It remains as a permanent constituent of that part of the hair, slowly moving up as the hair grows from below, until at last it is snipped off by the barber, or if the owner is a long-haired woman, it continues to creep along until the hair is full grown and drops out. Then the arsenic remains always in the same spot? Yes, it is a local deposit at a particular point in the hair. and this, Mayfield, is a most important fact, as you will see presently. For observe what follows. Hair grows at a uniform rate, roughly a 50th of an inch in 24 hours. It is consequently possible, by measurement, to fix nearly exactly the age of any given point on a hair. Thus, if we have a complete hair, and we find at any point in it a deposit of arsenic, by measuring from that point to the root we can fix within quite narrow limits the date on which that dose of arsenic was taken. But is it possible to do this? I asked. Not in the case of a single hair, he replied, but in the case of a tress, in which all the hairs are of the same age, it is perfectly possible. You will see the important bearing of this presently. To return now to my investigation. I had the bulk of a candle and a tress of Stella's hair. The questions to be settled were, 1. Was there arsenic in the candle? And 2. Had Stella been poisoned with arsenic? I began by trimming the wax mold in readiness for casting, and then I made an analysis of the trimmings. The result was the discovery of considerable quantities of arsenic in the wax. That answered the first question. Next, as the tress of hair was larger than was required for your purpose, I ventured to sacrifice a portion of it for a preliminary test. That test also gave a positive result. The quantity of arsenic was, of course, very minute, but still it was measurable by the delicate methods that are possible in dealing with arsenic, and the amount that I found pointed either to one large dose or to repeated smaller ones. The two questions were now answered definitely. It was certain, and the certainty could be demonstrated to a jury, that Stella had been poisoned by arsenic, and that the arsenic had been administered by means of poisoned candles. The complete proof in this case lent added weight to the less complete proof in the case of Monkhouse, and the two cases served to corroborate one another in pointing to Barbara as the poisoner. For she was the common factor in the two cases. The other persons, Wallingford, Madeline, and the others, who appeared in the Monkhouse case, made no appearance in the case of Stella, and the persons who were associated with Stella were not associated with Monkhouse. But Barbara was associated with both, and her absence from home was no answer to the charge if death was caused by candles which she admittedly supplied. But complete as the proof was, I wished if possible to make it yet more complete, to associate Barbara still more definitely with the crime. In the case of Monkhouse, it was clear that the poisoning always occurred when she was absent from home. But this was not so clear in the case of Stella. Your diary showed that Stella's relapses coincided pretty regularly with Barbara's absences, but it was not certain, though obviously probable, that the relapses coincided with the periods of poisoning. If it could be proved that they did coincide, that proof would furnish corroboration of the greatest possible weight. It would show that the two cases were parallel in all respects. But could it be proved? If the tress of Stella's hair had been at my disposal, I had no doubt that I could have decided the question. But the tress was yours, and it had to be preserved. Whatever was to be done must be done without destroying or injuring the hair, and I set myself the task of finding some practicable method. Eventually I decided, without much hope of success, to try the X-rays. As arsenic is a fairly dense metal, and the quantity of it in the deposits quite considerable, it seemed to me possible that it might increase the density of the hairs at those points sufficiently to affect the X-ray shadow. At any rate, I decided to give the method a trial. Accordingly, Polton and I set to work at it. First, in order to get the densest shadow possible, we made the tress up into a close cylinder, carefully arranging it so that all the cut ends were in exactly the same plane. Then we made a number of graduated exposures on process plates, developing and intensifying with the object of getting the greatest possible degree of contrast. The result was unexpectedly successful. In the best negative, the shape of the tress was fairly visible and was soon to be crossed by a number of perfectly distinct pale bands. Those bands were the shadows of the deposits of arsenic. There could be no doubt on the subject, for apart from the fact that there was nothing else that they could be, their appearance agreed exactly with what would have expected. Each band presented a sharp, distinct edge towards the tips of the hairs and faded away imperceptibly towards the roots. The sharp edge corresponded to the sudden appearance of arsenic in the blood when the poisoning began. The gradual fading away corresponded to the period of elimination when the poisoning had ceased and the quantity of arsenic in the blood was becoming less and less from day to day. Now, since hair grows at a known uniform rate, it was possible to convert the distances between these arsenical bands into periods of time. Not with perfect exactness, because the rate of growth varies slightly in different persons, but with sufficient exactness for our present purpose. As soon as I looked at those bands, I saw that they told the whole story. But let us follow the method of proof. Assuming the rate of growth to be 1/50th of an inch in 24 hours, which was probably correct for a person of Stella's age, I measured off on the photograph 7 inches and a quarter from the cut ends as representing the last year of her life. Of course, I did not know how close to the head the hair had been cut, but judging by the bands, I assumed that it had been cut quite close to the skin, within a quarter of an inch. I happen to know that you were quite right, said I, but I can't imagine how you arrived at your conclusion. It is quite a simple inference, he replied, as you will see presently. But to return to the photograph. Of the measured space of 7 inches and a quarter, I took a tracing on sheet celluloid, marking the sharp edges of the bands, the points at which the fading began and the points at which the bands ceased to be visible. This tracing I transferred to paper ruled in tenths of an inch, a tenth of an inch representing 5 days, and I joined the points where the fading began and ended by a sloping line. I now had a diagram, or chart, which showed, with something approaching to accuracy, the duration of each administration of arsenic and the time which elapsed between the successive poisonings. This is the chart. The sloping lines show the fading of the bands. He handed me a paper which he had just taken from a drawer, and I looked at it curiously, but with no great interest. As I returned it, after a brief inspection, I remarked, "It is quite clear and intelligible, but I don't quite see why you took the considerable trouble of making it. Does it show anything that could not be stated in a few words?" "Not by itself," he replied, "but you remember that I mentioned having made 2 other charts, one showing the fluctuations in Stella's illness, and the other showing Barbara's absences from home during the same period. Here are those other 2 charts, and now if you put the 3 together, your eye can take in at a glance a fact of fundamental importance, which is that the relapses, the absences, and the poisonings all coincide in time. The periodicity is strikingly irregular, but it is identical in all 3 charts. I made these to hand to the jury, and I think they would have been quite convincing, since any juryman could check them by the dates given in evidence, and by the inspection of the radiograph of the hair. Please note, the reader now pauses the narration to describe the appearance of 3 charts embedded in the chapter. They are labeled A, B, and C. All 3 charts are graphs which depict the months of 1 year from November to the following October. Charts A and B are marked with lines spanning those months, while Chart C is marked with solid bars, depicting time periods within those same months. The narration now continues as follows. Explanation of the charts. Chart A shows the fluctuations in the illness of Stella Keene during the year preceding her death in October, divided into intervals of 5 days. Chart B shows the distribution of the arsenical bands in Stella Keene's hair. The steep sides of the curves towards the tips of the hairs show the sudden appearance of the deposit, and the sloping sides towards the roots of the hairs represent its more gradual fading. Each of the narrow divisions represents 5 days' growth. Chart C shows the periods during which Barbara was absent from home, each absence being represented by a black column, divided into intervals of 5 days. I gazed at the 3 charts and was profoundly impressed by the convincing way in which they demonstrated the connection between Barbara's movements and the results of her diabolical activities. But what impressed me still more was the amazing ingenuity with which Thorndyke had contrived to build up a case of the most deadly precision and completeness out of what seemed, even to my trained intelligence, no more than a few chance facts, apparently quite trivial and irrelevant. "It seems," I said, "that so far as you were concerned, the exhumation was really unnecessary." "Quite," he replied. "It proved nothing that was not already certain. Still, the Commissioner was quite right. For the purposes of a trial, evidence obtained from the actual body of the victim is of immeasurably more weight than indirect scientific evidence, no matter how complete. An ordinary juryman might have difficulty in realizing that the hair is part of the body, and that proof of arsenical deposit in the hair is proof of arsenic in the body. But the mistake that he made, as events turned out, was in refusing to make the arrest until my statements had been confirmed by the autopsy and the analysis. That delay allowed the criminal to escape. Not that I complain. To me, personally, her suicide came as a blessed release from an almost intolerable position. But if I had been in his place, I would have taken no chances. She would have gone to trial and to the gallows. Yes, I admitted, that was what justice demanded. But I cannot be thankful enough for the delay that let her escape. Fiend as she was, it would have been a frightful thing to have had to give the evidence that would have hanged her. It would, he agreed, and the thought of it was a nightmare to me. However, we have escaped that, and after all, justice has been done. We were silent for a few minutes, during which Thorndyke smoked his pipe with a certain air of attention, as if he expected me to put some further questions. And in fact, there were one or two questions that I wanted to have answered. I began with the simplest. I am still a little puzzled by some of the circumstances in this case. The infernal machine I happen to know to have been sent by Barbara, though I don't understand why she sent it. But Wallingford's proceedings are a complete mystery to me. What do you suppose induced him to keep a watch on you in that extraordinary fashion? And who was the man who shadowed him? There certainly was such a man, for I saw him myself. And the same man had been shadowing Miss Norris. What do you make of it all? One can only reason from past experiences, he replied. It seems to be a rule that a person who has committed a crime cannot remain quiet and let things take their course. There appears to be an irresistible impulse to lay down false clues and create misleading appearances. It is always a mistake, unless the false clues are laid down in advance, and even then it is apt to fail and unexpectedly furnish a real clue. Now Barbara, with all her astonishing cleverness, made that mistake. She laid down a false clue in advance by her absences from home, and the trick certainly worked successfully at the inquest. But it was precisely those absences that put me on the track of the candle, which otherwise might have passed unsuspected. The faked medicine was another false clue, which attracted my attention and added to my suspicion concerning the candle. Then, after the event, came these other endeavors to mislead. They did neither harm nor good, as it happened, since I had already marked her down as the principal suspect. But if I had been in doubt, I should have followed up those clues and found her at the end of them. As to Wallingford, I imagine that she led him to believe that I was employed by you to fix the crime on him, and that he was advised to watch me and be ready to anticipate any move on my part, her actual object being to cause him to behave in such a manner as to attract suspicious attention. The function of the private detective, for that is what he must have been, would be to keep Wallingford's nerves, and Miss Norris's too, in such a state that they would appear anxious and terrified and tend to attract attention. The infernal machine was primarily intended, I think, to cast suspicion on one or both of them. That was what I inferred from the total absence of fingerprints and the flagrantly indefinable character of the pistol in the wool. But the greatest, the most fatal mistake that Barbara made was the one that is absolutely characteristic of the criminal. She repeated the procedure of a previous crime that had been successful. It was that repetition that was her undoing. Either crime separately might have been difficult to fix on her. As it was, each crime was proof of the other. Once more we fell silent, and still Thorndyke had the air of expecting some further question from me. I looked at him nervously, for there was something that I wanted to ask, and yet I hardly dared to put it into words. For as I had looked at those charts, a horrid suspicion had taken hold of me. I feared to have it confirmed, and yet I could not let it rest. At last I summoned courage enough to put the question. "Thorndyke," I said, "I want you to tell me something. I expect you know what it is." He looked up and nodded gravely. "You mean about Stella?" said he. "Yes. How long would she have lived if she had not been poisoned?" He looked away for a few moments, and impassive as his face was, I could see that he was deeply moved. At length he replied, "I was afraid you were going to ask me that, but since you have, I can only answer you honestly. So far as I can judge, But for that accursed ghoul, the poor girl might have been alive and well at this moment. I stared at him in amazement. "Do you mean," I demanded, "that she was not really suffering from consumption at all?" "That is what it amounts to," he replied. "There were signs of old tubercular trouble, but there was nothing recent. Evidently she had good powers of resistance, and the disease had not only become stationary, but was practically extinct. The old lesions had undergone complete repair, and there is no reason to suppose that any recurrence would have taken place under ordinary conditions." "But," I exclaimed, hardly able to believe that the disaster had been so overwhelmingly complete, "what about the cough? I know that she always had a more or less troublesome cough." "So had Monkhouse," he replied, "and so would anyone have had whose lungs were periodically irritated by inhaling particles of arsenious acid. But the tubercular mischief was quite limited and recovery must have commenced early. And Barbara, watching eagerly the symptoms of the disease which was to rid her of her rival, must have noted with despair the signs of commencing recovery, and at last resolved to do for herself what nature was failing to do. Doubtless the special method of poisoning was devised to imitate the symptoms of the disease, which it did well enough to deceive those whose minds were prepared by the antecedent illness to receive the suggestion. It was a horribly, fiendishly ingenious crime, calmly, callously devised and carried out to its appalling end with the most hideous efficiency." After he had finished speaking, I remained gazing at him dumbly, stupefied, stunned by the realization of the enormity of this frightful thing that had befallen. He too seemed quite overcome, for he sat silently, grasping his extinct pipe and looking sternly and fixedly into the fire. At length he spoke, but without removing his gaze from the bright embers. "I am trying, Mayfield," he said gently, "to think of something to say to you, but there is nothing to say. The disaster is too complete, too irretrievable. This terrible woman has so far wrecked your life, and I recognize that you will carry the burden of your loss so long as you live. It would be a mere impertinence to utter futile and banal condolences. You know what I, your friend, am feeling, and I need say no more than that. And I have too much confidence in your wisdom and courage to think of exhortations. But though you have been robbed of the future that might have been, there is still a future that may be. It remains to you now only to shoulder your fardel and begin your pilgrimage anew, and if the road shall seem at first a dreary one, you need not travel it alone. You have friends, and one of them will think it a privilege to bear you company and try to hearten you by the way." He held out his hand, and I grasped it silently with a full heart. And the closer friendship that was inaugurated in that hand-clasp was endured through the passing years, ever more precious and more helpful. End of chapter 18. End of As a Thief in the Night by Arthur B. Reeve.